big old moons keep on shining. Won't you rise up from the sea like a rose that leads to Boston, where my true love waits for me.
The leading theory about the origins of the moon is that about 4.5 billion years ago, an object about the size of Mars collided with the Earth, and that event is called the cataclysmic bombardment. And that event is responsible for Earth's tilt, the fact that it's stratified into layers, and the fact that we have a moon. This photograph here shows the relative size of Earth and its moon. And the basic motion of the moon is that it orbits around the Earth counterclockwise in an elliptical orbit, and that one revolution takes about 27.3 days. When the moon is closest to the Earth, we call that perigee, and when it is furthest from the Earth, we call that apogee. The Earth is located at one of the foci of the moon's elliptical orbit. When the moon is at perigee, it's slightly bigger in appearance than when it is at apogee. And on page 15 of your reference table, you'll notice something unusual is that the moon's period of revolution is the same as its period of rotation. And the result of this is that the same side of the moon is always facing the Earth. It wasn't until the 1960s during the moon missions that we first were able to see images of the far side of the moon. The moon does not produce its own light. The reason we can see the moon is because it's reflecting light from the sun. In this image, we see that the right side of the moon and the Earth are lit up by the sun, and so we can infer which direction the sun must be located. In this next diagram, we can see the moon orbiting around the Earth. Now, half of the moon is always lit up by the sun, but it's not always the same half that is facing the Earth. We can see, for example, on the left side, in the new moon, that's when the side that it has no sunlight is facing the Earth, and so we can't see the moon at all. On the right side, we see that the side that is lit up by the sun is completely facing the Earth, and that would be a full moon. The other phases are points in between the new moon and the full moon. There are two terms to describe how the moon is progressing through its phases. A waning moon is when the moon appears to be getting smaller, and a waning moon is always lit up on the left side. A waxing moon is when the moon appears to be getting bigger, and a waxing moon is always lit up on the right side. Throughout the month, you'll notice that the moon looks different. We call the moon's different shapes the phases of the moon. The first part of the name refers to whether it's waxing or waning, and the second part refers to the shape of the moon. The full moon is when the moon is totally lit up from our perspective. Remember, though, that half the moon is lit up. It's just not always the side that's facing us. A gibbous moon is when the moon is almost full. It sort of looks like an egg shape. A quarter moon is when the moon is half lit up. They call this a quarter moon instead of a half moon because the moon is a quarter way through its phases. A crescent moon is when only a small sliver of the moon is lit up. It looks kind of like a crescent roll. And a new moon is when the moon is not lit up at all from our perspective. It takes 27.3 days for one full orbit, but 29.5 days for one full cycle of the moon's phases. The reason for this is a bit complicated. If you consider the new moon phase when the moon is between the Earth and the sun as a starting point, notice that it takes 27.3 days for the moon to make one full orbit back to where it started, but that when it returns to its starting position, it's not at the new moon phase. It takes an additional 2.2 days before the Earth, the moon, and the sun are lined up again. When the moon, the Earth, and the sun are perfectly lined up, it's called syzygy. However, this doesn't happen very often, and the reason is because the moon's orbit is tilted 5 degrees from the plane of the Earth's orbit. When syzygy does occur, it sometimes results in an eclipse. A lunar eclipse happens during syzygy when the moon passes through the Earth's umbra, which is a fancy name for a shadow. A lunar eclipse happens twice a year, but you have to be at a certain location on Earth to be able to see it. A solar eclipse happens when the moon is between the sun and the Earth. The sun appears to disappear because the moon is blocking its light. Partial solar eclipses happen about once a year, but a total solar eclipse only happens about once every 200 years. Remember that the more massive something is, the more gravity it has? Well, the Earth is more massive than the moon, so the moon is held in orbit by Earth's gravity. But the moon has just enough gravity to affect the water on Earth. As the Earth turns, whatever side is facing the moon experiences a high tide. The moon's gravity pulls the water on Earth toward it, causing the oceans on one side of the planet to bulge toward the moon. Water on the other side of the Earth from the moon also experiences a tidal bulge or a high tide. Throughout the day, every 6 hours, we change from low tide to high tide, which means that from one high tide to the next is 12 hours. We have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. The sun also has an effect on Earth's oceans. When the sun and the moon are aligned, they both have an effect on the tides. This causes very high tides and very low tides. These are called spring tides. When the sun and the moon are at a right angle, only the moon has a strong effect on the tides, and this causes moderate high tides and moderate low tides, and these are called neap tides.